Good afternoon and welcome to the show. I'm Simi Sara. The workforce is changing out there, and there are a couple of reasons for that. One, the economy, of course. Two, as a result of economic problems, older workers are staying in their jobs even when their employers don't necessarily want them to. As a result, more lawsuits involving older workers. To talk more about this, Stuart Rudner joins me now, a Toronto-based employment lawyer and founding partner of Rudner McDonald LLP. Stuart, thanks for being here.
Simi, thanks very much for having me on the show.
Is this a problem that you're seeing more and more of?
Absolutely, and you hit the nails on the head about why it's happening, and we're seeing workers who are staying on into their late 60s, 70s, and 80s. And actually, just last year, we had wrongful dismissal claims in Ontario where employees in their 70s and 80s were let go and sued for wrongful dismissal.
And are they winning these cases, or are these cases that you've never seen before?
What used to happen is, whenever you're let go, you're entitled to severance or notice, and you always have to figure out how much you're entitled to. Traditionally, the courts would look at somebody in their 60s, or they never really saw people in their 70s or 80s, but look at people in their 60s and they would say, you know what, they're going to retire soon anyway, so the notice period would be fairly short. Last year, we had a 70-year-old employee who was a laborer, blue-collar position, 20 years of service, and he got 22 months of severance. So, completely turning employment law on its head in that sense. And the courts are recognizing that people are working longer because in most cases they have to. And they are not going to force them to retire, and they are not going to assume that they'll retire voluntarily.
So companies, they think they can save some money by getting rid of the older workers that are close to retirement?
Well, that's what often happens. Is you look at what you're paying a long-term older employee, and you think I can get somebody who's younger, less experienced, and cheaper. And what's changed really is that in the past, when you had mandatory retirement, you knew that somebody was going to leave at a certain point. So even if an older worker was slowing down, not contributing the way they used to, employers could essentially leave them alone, let them retire with dignity, and know they're going to move on. Now there's no end date, and what you often see is essentially a game of chicken, where the employee is not going to leave because they know if they leave, they don't get a package, and the employer is scared to get rid of them because they're scared of how big the package will be.
And so they just wait and see what happens? Like, if you're an employee and you think this might be happening to you, what are the signs? What can an employer get away with and what can't they get away with?
Well, that's a great question. And our firm works with both employers and employees. So we like to pride ourselves on taking a balanced perspective on these things. And so when we work with individuals, we often have people come in and say, look, I used to be in charge of A, B, C, and D, and now I'm being marginalized, I'm not being included in meetings, I'm not contributing to decisions, I'm basically being left and isolated. And that's what employers will often do. They'll assume that if they leave the employee alone, isolate them, and make their lives miserable or at least unhappy, the employee will just give in and leave. So that's what employers will sometimes try to do. And conversely, sometimes you'll have employees who will say, you know what, I'm not going to leave, but I will just sit here and do nothing and convince the employer to give me a package to go away.
So rather than retire, even though they could, the employee might also think that, no, I'm going to make it worth my while. Well,
exactly, and I can fully understand it from the individual's point of view.
Yeah.
Why would you leave and get nothing when you could otherwise get a pretty significant package if the employer decides to let you go? So as I said, it becomes a game of chicken. And we often work with employers who call and say, I have a worker who's older, has been here a long time, and they're just not performing anymore, and what can I do about it? And it's really difficult, I have to say, because as soon as you do anything that can be seen as being related to someone's age, you're breaching the Human Rights Code, and you open yourself up to more damages.
And so are the courts recognizing this more and more?
They absolutely are. The courts are recognizing that people are working later in life, and they are, age is a protected ground. So one of the things we often coach employers on is if you're going to work with an employee who is legitimately not performing as they should, it's okay to work with them and offer them coaching, but avoid any references to their age, avoid any euphemisms, avoid saying things like you seem to be slowing down or you're not performing like you're a young pup or that kind of thing. Keep age completely out of the discussion and focus on performance. But even then, quite frankly, sometimes employers will call me and say, can we fire somebody for cause because they're not performing anymore? And I've spent a lot of time over the years looking at just cause decisions. I actually wrote a book called You're Fired, which is all about when you can fire somebody for cause. You can fire people for cause in Canada. It's not easy. You can fire people because their performance is not up to par. but it's even more difficult. And when you throw the age factor into the mix, usually what I'll tell employers is it's not worth the risk. Just treat the person fairly, give them an appropriate package, and then move on.
Yeah, that's the part I don't understand sometimes, right? It seems like the company is willing to go to war over something where if they had just given them a little bit more money, they probably would have gone quietly.
That's a great point, and I think you're absolutely right. Rather than go to war, and it impacts morale as well. You don't want to be known as the company who is turfing out your long-serving employees because nobody else is going to want to work there. So treat the person fairly, as I said. And one thing I've often done with employer clients in the past, and fairly recent past, is we'll take the person who's been in the company for a long time. Maybe they're not performing as well as they used to, but they've got tremendous experience and tremendous knowledge, and you can use them as a mentor. Get them to train essentially the other workers in those positions. Take advantage of their skills in other ways, and at least you'll get some value for your money while they're still on the payroll.
Is documentation the key here, Stuart? Like if a company is committed to making sure they, dot every I and cross every T, do they have to keep track of every time there's a problem?
I mean, if you're going to even consider a just cause dismissal, arguing that their performance is not up to par, then yes, you have to document everything and give the worker clear warning that their performance is not sufficient, and if it continues, then they will be dismissed. But quite frankly, when we're talking about a long-service employee, I would be very hesitant to even go down that road.
Really? So companies, should just not say anything at all?
Either not say something, or like I was saying a few months ago, maybe put the person in a different role where they become a mentor and talk to the person. You have to handle this very carefully, but you could talk to the person about their future plans and maybe develop some sort of a going forward plan where you'll be in a mentoring role for a year or two, and then at that point we'll have a package and you can move on and retire. So that's another key point, is communication. Rather than the employee waiting for a package and the employer waiting for the employee to quit, the two of them can actually sit down and talk and discuss where they each want to go and how they can make the situation work.
Okay, so there is no real legal way to complain about having an older worker on your payroll?
Well, not just because you have an older worker. If you truly have somebody who is just not working, refusing to work, refusing to contribute, then, to your point, documentation is the key. You've got to warn them, you've got to document the issues, you've essentially got to build your file, and then you can look at dismissal. But until you do that, communication is going to be your key strategy.
What is your advice then to an older worker who fears that despite their best efforts, they are being targeted because they're just, that age?
We've worked with employees who are in that type of situation, and the first thing we always tell them is, look, if things are being done, if you're being isolated or marginalized, call the employer on it by documenting everything. Same point we make to the employer. Document it, send emails to your manager, and set out in very clear detail what you perceive to be happening, and put the onus on them to respond. Because that way, if more things happened or if they are let go, you've now built the file to show that you were being discriminated against on the basis of your age.
Right, but just know that this stuff is happening out there. Like, we have to be proactive.
From both sides, you have to be proactive. Whether you're waiting for the employee to leave or whether you suspect your employer is trying to get rid of you, be proactive and document everything. And everyone's got to realize that, as you said at the very beginning, the times are changing and we're dealing with a significantly aging workforce.
Right, and maybe companies need to rethink that as well. They need to rethink the fact that just because their employees are getting older, they might not be as useful anymore.
Yeah, and they shouldn't go into it with that assumption, because employers, even older employees, can be quite effective or efficient. And like I've mentioned, even if they may not be doing their traditional job, in a mentoring role, in a training role, there are lots of things, there are lots of ways that older workers that can contribute. So have the discussion with them rather than just giving up and saying, we need to cut our ties and move on.
Interesting. Stuart, thank you.
Thanks very much for having me on the show.
That is Stuart Rudner, a Toronto-based employment lawyer and founding partner of Rudner McDonald LLP, talking about a lot of the cases that they deal with, which is workers suing employers for age discrimination, employers wanting to know how they can get rid of an employee who is at that retirement age and they don't want to get sued for it. It's a complicated issue, but I want to ask you this question. Have you ever, do you think, experienced age discrimination while on the job? Give me a call, 604-280-9898 or 1-877-399-9898. Is there age discrimination out there? Tell me your story. We'll take your calls when we come back.